So, at least when I've been prowling the internet, I've noticed that a lot of people have been recommending genre fiction, fantasy, horror, thrillers, romance, and comparatively fewer people have been recommending literary fiction and historical fiction. To be fair, I both love genre fiction and have been deeply impacted by literary fiction, so as I go through my little topics here, just keep that in mind. In this video, we're going to talk about how literary fiction has kind of been losing its power, and then we're going to discuss if genre fiction really sufficiently fills the gap. Some current perspectives. But first, let's hear from some wonderful readers and creators. That reading guide created a tag called the snob-o-meter tag.
I decided, out of whim, to create my own tag, an original tag called the snob-o-meter tag.
And I'll let him introduce the first question, and we'll hear a couple perspectives from readers around BookTube.
So I'll get right into it. I'll start off with the first question. What is your definition of book snobbery?
Like looking down on others who read genres that you don't approve of.
Okay. I think it's also people that are like boastful about like their prestigious types of books that they read.
If you're dismissing an entire genre without reading it, without using your critical faculty, and you're just dismissing the entire genre of say science fiction, then that is snobbery.
And I think you can include in that being judgmental of your own taste. So I think people can be snobbish about their own taste sometimes. They can feel ashamed to be reading, Ice Planet Barbarians or whatever.
A lot of these creators are tapping into something that's bothered people for a long time, and it's the idea of judging people for their book choices, assuming if they pick certain books that they are literary geniuses, and if they pick others, they're just having fun and it's only escapism and they're not really getting anything deep out of what they read. One stereotype is thoughtful, and one stereotype is shallow, and a lot of people aren't having it. The history of book snobbery and the dismissal of genre fiction. Book snobbery did not come from nowhere. It's not just in people's heads, it definitely came from somewhere real. To simplify it a little bit, for a long time in the 1800s and in the early 1900s, there was sort of a group of people who got to decide what book had merit and what book didn't. A lot of professors and people with influence would oftentimes assign the same type of books, talk about the same type of books, and assume that they had the highest amount of merit, and we kind of formed something like the literary canon, which is nothing formal, but it was culturally prevalent nonetheless. And what did they decide had merit? Something realistic. They went for fiction that felt like was real life, and oftentimes would dismiss things that felt more like fantasy or more like genre fiction. For example, even though now Frankenstein is considered a classic, when Mary Shelley first published Frankenstein in 1818, there was a little bit of discourse about it, if it counted as something that you could actually get something from, or if it was just a high-thrill gothic adventure with all of the speculative elements it includes. Now, there were some people who noticed its brilliance right away, so I don't want to oversimplify it, but since it was kind of in that genre fiction segment of literature, some people didn't think it had very much merit. Also, let's not forget that it was a sexist period. I did find this comment as a review to Mary Shelley's Frankenstein that was contemporary to the period, and it says, "The writer of it is, we understand, a female. This is an aggravation of that which is the prevailing fault of the novel." But not everyone criticized it on that low hit level where it's just like, oh, she's a woman, so it obviously can't be that good. Some people just were trying to decide if it could have literary merit, if it was also sort of a gothic horror story, or if it had to be more realistic to real life in order to count as something that was something you can get something deep out of. In the 1900s, book marketing focused a lot more on categorizing books into specific genres that were shelved in specific ways. Genre fiction was oftentimes published as mass market paperback copies and sold at airports and grocery stores, while literary fiction that was supposed to have deeper meaning was carefully bound in hardcover books and given special awards. For a while, it was definitely harder to get genre fiction to be taken seriously. We did have some people who pulled it off, like J.R.R. Tolkien with Lord of the Rings, but the examples of people who were taken seriously for their genre fiction pieces were few and far between. Most genre fiction was dismissed somewhat as lowbrow fiction, and literary fiction was considered highbrow fiction where you could actually understand the human experience. The cultural uprising that put genre fiction front and center. So I mentioned genre fiction being printed in mass market paperback books. It was sort of a double-edged sword to do that. Maybe it was a slight cultural insult in a way, even though I don't think anyone actively meant it that way, but what it did mean is a lot of people ended up getting their hands on these mass market paperback copies, and a lot of people started reading things that were very much branded as genre fiction. People started picking up a lot more, say, fantasy books, and a lot of people started picking up more romance books. Communities formed and nerd culture, so to speak, started becoming more and more mainstream. I'm talking Comic-Cons, fantasy conventions, and romance book clubs. And then we had the internet where anyone could talk about anything. Before, there were certain voices that were elevated because of privilege. They had the ability to get their opinions out into the mainstream. But when we have things come up like YouTube and other internet sources, if you could get people to read what you had to say or listen to what you had to say, you could be influential even if you didn't have the traditional background that would get you into the discourse and the public space. I guess this section easily could have been called like the democratization of literature, because your voice and opinion on books matters a lot more if other people have access to it. And along the lines of changing trends and the democratization of literature, literary trends have changed too. More fantasy books and dystopian books and just general speculative fiction books have won awards from prestigious organizations, way more than they were winning 50 to 100 years ago, for sure. I think we have culturally realized that a fantasy book can also be literary, a science fiction book can look deeper into human dynamics, societies, and emerging trends, and a romance book can give us a lot more understanding of the depth of the human soul and human relationships. Not all fantasy books are literary, not all science fiction books are literary, but a lot of them are. Choose your genre. With the destigmatization of genre fiction that we have seen in recent decades, it's become more and more common for a reader to pick a favorite genre and stick to it somewhat religiously. We are witnessing the emergence of genre experts, readers who are well known enough because they post enough online or they talk about a genre all the time, and they know what there is to know about the genre that they've chosen. Daniel Green kind of comes to mind. And in a way, this is great because we have discovered that oftentimes genre fiction and literary fiction can hit on the same themes, and having someone dedicated to learning everything there is to learn about a genre gives a lot of people insight into what they can gain from reading a particular type of literature. So genre experts oftentimes, even when they don't read very much literary fiction, have a lot to say about literature. Some people have begun to be a little annoyed with people sticking way too much to one particular genre, especially when they tend to stick to a particular subgenre. For example, there seems to be a lot of people who gripe about a lot of young women who have fallen into a romantasy rabbit hole lately, and they get criticized for reading practically the same book over and over again, and people wonder if they can be getting the same out of literature if everything they read follows the same tropes. We have a lot of people talking about the tropification of books, where it's basically someone saying, I like enemies to lovers, so I'm going to read 30 books in a row that have that particular element of a book. And whilst there might be some truth to that, and there might be something that's partially true, I do think that it's kind of a shame if we kind of go backwards in time to where we start stigmatizing genres and subgenres more as soon as women discover romantasy, along with its batwings, shadow daddies, and mating bonds. A lot of people become uncomfortable with decisions women make, and they have a really high bar for the type of books they want women to read in order to be considered real literary readers. And to be fair, and not to just sit here and demean women, we also know that there's a lot of men out there who aren't reading very much at all right now. And I've read some of these just for fun romantasies. And I also want to point out that even when we have a subgenre like romantasy that has a lot of criticism, literary romantasy still exists. With all of this in mind, I still think overly defining your genre and subgenre has the potential to limit your worldview and limit your experiences that you get through reading. I noticed actually that Daniel Green, and maybe a year ago, did a little bit of a channel rebrand where he decided he didn't want to just be called a fantasy channel anymore, but he wanted to go more into the speculative fiction space. I'll have him talk about that for a second.
Where are the bounds of where this channel can go? Is historical fiction off the table? I would say nay, sir.
This clip is like a year old. Has Daniel Green reviewed historical fiction yet? I don't think so. But it's cool that he's open to it.
And so for henceforth now on, I'm planning on labeling this channel a speculative fiction space.
And it's really interesting to see that after years of making content in his favorite genre, he no longer wanted to be so narrowly defined. And while I think the average reader probably would tend to want to read more than one genre, I do think that there is definitely something to be said for some readers to be in that genre expert space, and I think a lot of us benefit from watching their content in their videos and from their depth of knowledge on one particular subject. Did we overcorrect? The benefits of literary fiction. I don't really particularly care what you read, but I do wonder if there's something that we culturally lose if we all just pick up our favorite genre and start doing the opposite, where we're almost dismissing literary fiction. While I definitely think it's true that there is a huge overlap between genre and literary fiction where we can kind of engage with both spaces, I do think that there is something to be said for picking up books that are primarily meant to be literary. And what I mean by that is a book crafted specifically to teach you about the human experience and to make a point, and one that's not crafted primarily to entertain. I saved one response from the snob-o-meter tag for this moment. This is Hannah, and she prefers literary and classics from what I can tell on her channel. I'll have you see her reaction to the snob-o-meter tag.
I was tagged by several people, which usually is incredibly flattering. But in this case, I'm not totally comfortable that my name comes up so readily when you think about snobbishness.
From that first clip, you can see she's engaging with the topic, but she's also wondering if people are lightly calling her out. So she's not like overly defensive or anything. I don't want to miscategorize this, but she is kind of wondering if she's almost being called a snob.
So here's the problem. Even if a reader would never look down on people making their own reading choices, is it snobbery if you find yourself reading a fairly high percentage of books that fall into that category?
For example, over the summer I was asked what I was reading, and I said Plato, and I said it almost bashfully, like I was quite embarrassed. I almost wish I could have said like Colleen Hoover or something.
I hope we don't start seeing almost the opposite trend from the one that we criticized that happened for so long. I wouldn't want our culture to be one in which you could read Ice Planet Barbarians in public. I really do like Ruby Dixon, by the way. But you're almost ashamed when you read War and Peace in public. Not so much that it's shameful, but people might be like, oh, who does she think she is? And I don't think we're there yet. I don't think as an overall cultural people care that much what you read, but I want to get to the point where that was a thing. It is possible and probable that the focus of reading or the purpose of reading is shifting from widening your worldview and learning to a form of entertainment. And that matches other trends for sure. We're definitely in a period of like the attention economy where everything is competing for people's attention. To be frank and honest, I'm just kind of shocked that you made it this far into a YouTube video about a topic of literary versus genre fiction. And I don't think that it's a bad thing to read for entertainment. Heck, if you're choosing books to entertain you over TV shows and TikTok, that's really impressive in itself. And if you're doing both, that's completely normal. I've just been thinking on this topic a lot, and recently I picked up a book called When the Emperor Was Divine. This is a library copy, so I'm sorry if it like bounces off the light or whatnot, because there's like plastic on the cover. Shout out to your public library. And is it okay to admit that this was not entertaining? Because by no means was this book entertaining to me. I did not sit here and think, oh, what a page turner. I can't wait to find out what happens next. None of that was happening as I was reading this book. But I still think that there was something that I got out of this that I would not have been able to appreciate if I needed it to be constantly entertaining. When the Emperor Was Divine is a book about a family that goes to a Japanese internment camp during World War II. If you were just unaware of that history, during World War II, because of some heavy mistrust that was just around in culture, Japanese Americans were sent to these internment camps. It was definitely a dark part of American history, and one that I think most Americans should be aware of. And this story follows a family that's sent to one, and it makes very literary choices. For example, we don't even have character names in this book. So how can you be, in a way, entertained and connected to characters if you don't even have character names? But it was done purposefully. We follow the woman, the boy, the girl, and even the white dog. And I would speculate that the reason this author made that choice was because the particular characters in this book were kind of placeholders for real people. It was kind of made so simplistic so that it could represent almost any average experience of someone who actually did go through this. And part of me fears that books like this, that are not particularly entertaining, might have a hard time in the future unless they become more traditionally entertaining, especially in this limited attention economy that we have happening with most people. If it's not immediately a page turner, a lot of people will put it down, even if it's a relatively short book. On the flip side to that example, literary fiction is also meant to increase empathy. It follows people in dark moments and can get very internally in their head. It's written to prompt critical thinking and introspection, and oftentimes that can be at the expense of traditional entertainment. Life on Books had a podcast guest that briefly touched on this.
I don't like to make a big distinction between genre fiction and literary fiction and be all hierarchical about it, but there is a piece of this in the studies that have been done that show that having that literary quality is part of what makes this work.
I totally believe her. I am curious as to what studies she's talking about. I would like to look at them personally.
What makes something literary in the way that these studies are talking about is that they show you the interiority of the characters.
It's kind of interesting that she says that about literary fiction because it's kind of the opposite of the example I just gave, but both definitely fit. And I think this whole really getting into that interiority of the character is what allows you to really work on your own empathy skills. So I'm going to let her keep talking for a second.
So if you were reading just a real page-turner adventure story where you're not really in the heads of the characters, it's not going to have this effect, because part of what makes it build your empathy is you're in the mind of the protagonist. So you're experiencing what the protagonist is experiencing.
And she goes on to say if a book wasn't written with that intent, it takes a lot more personal creativity to get the same meaning from it. And of course, I did already mention that there are books that are both genre fiction and literary. But as she did mention, if you never read anything that has literary elements or literary fiction, you aren't going to get the benefits that stem directly from that. You're going to get benefits from reading no matter what you read, but being able to pick out a book that you think is going to change your life and is going to be a little bit deeper for you occasionally is probably good practice. Classics and literary books are not untouchable. This section is going to be short, but it's still important. Remember, as people start picking up literary books and classics, that they are allowed to have whatever opinion they want. No book is beyond criticism. If we make a set of books untouchable, then a lot of people are not going to want to touch them, read them. Imagine I handed you this book and I said, read it, and it's good, and you have to tell me it's good. And if you don't like it, you're stupid and you don't understand literature. Are you now excited to read this book? It's a pretty good book, by the way. Of course not, because people should be allowed to have opinions even when books are literary or classics, and you shouldn't immediately dismiss them if they have something to say. This woman highlights her experience criticizing Wuthering Heights by Emily Bronte.
A book is a book, and if I say I don't like Wuthering Heights, then it's not because I haven't understood the novel, it's because I don't think it's a very good novel. Can we please cancel feeling superior to others based on the books that you've read?
And there seems to be a tendency to think that there's a correct or incorrect way to view and review literary fiction. And that tendency, especially when it comes to classics, is probably one of the reasons that a lot of people don't want to read them. They almost feel like they have to pretend to like the book and fall in line because they're not allowed to say that there was something about it that didn't sit right with them. Don't get me wrong, there are thoughtful responses to books and there are flippant responses to books. That I could definitely agree with. Not everyone critically thinks when they read, not everyone wants to do that. That being said, if someone has something to say about the book, listen to them. It kind of interrupts the echo chamber that some of those really, really highly thought of books oftentimes form, and they might actually have something that's worth thinking about. My final thoughts. So I mainly read genre fiction. I love fantasy books. I love horror books, and a lot of other books that fall into so many more categories. I still read literary fiction, and I still pick up classics from time to time. And when I pick up something like a fantasy book written by a very thoughtful author, I look for the literary elements, and I try to apply what the author is putting on the page to my reading experience and sometimes to my life. I do read to be entertained a lot of the time, but I also like to think that I read to be enlightened and to learn more about the world surrounding me. I don't care what you read. I definitely think that there are benefits to reading in every single way, no matter what genre you're picking up. I do personally think for myself that I enjoy balancing the fun of books that are just page turners with the depth of books that are saying something more. Let me know what you personally think in the comments. This is just one opinion.